Bueno, comenzaré con la presentación. Hola a todos y todas, les damos la bienvenida a esta tercera versión del Festival de Autores FAS, organizado por la Corporación del Libro y la Lectura a través de los diversos sellos editoriales y socios que la integran. Y particularmente agradecemos a Seguros Sura. FAS tiene como principal objetivo abrir nuevos espacios de encuentro entre los escritores y sus lectores, y en este contexto especial en el que seguimos enfrentando la pandemia, creemos más importante que nunca mantener vivos estos vínculos. Este año, FAS lo viviremos de manera 100% digital, que es la nueva forma de mantenernos cerca. Antes de dar la bienvenida a quienes me acompañan, les recuerdo a nuestros invitados y al público que esta actividad tiene una duración de 45 minutos. Ahora sí damos la bienvenida a la mesa de lanzamiento de conversación con Alia Trabuco y Judith Butler, en el que conversaremos a propósito de los libros Sin Miedo y La Fuerza de la No Violencia. Saludamos con mucho gusto a Judith Butler, destacada profesora, filósofa, pensadora, profesora de la Universidad de California, Berkeley, autora de los libros más importantes de feminismo de las últimas décadas, autora entre otros de El género en disputa, de Cuerpos que importan, y de otros títulos fundamentales también en el área de la filosofía política o la performance. Damos también la bienvenida a Alia Trabuco, que es abogada, editora y escritora. En 2014 publicó la novela La Resta y el año pasado publicó con sello Lumen su libro Las Homicidas, un espléndido ensayo con narrativa de no ficción. Les damos por favor el pase a la presentadora y a la autora para comenzar esta conversación. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Aldo. Hello, Judith. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to meet you. And I have so many questions today, so I'll skip all possible introductions and dive right into them.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and glad to
Thank
meet
you. So you recently published two books in Spanish, Sin Miedo, a collection of essays on themes such as resistance, feminism, and the future of the humanities, and La Fuerza de la No Violencia, a philosophical account that aims to rethink the question of vulnerability and why we preserve and not destroy the life of others. In these books, you formulate a sharp critique to the liberal idea of the autonomous individual and develop instead the concept of interdependency, arguing for a conception of equality that is no longer based on the fantasy of self-sufficiency, and I'm using that word, fantasy, but on the idea that we are all equal in our interdependency. In the face of the climate disaster that right now you're feeling in your room, as you were telling us, and in your throat with the smoke in California, and the current pandemic as well, that interdependency has become literally painfully clear. And you say that accepting it, you say this in Sin Miedo, can be a relief as it puts us in the world of the other. Yet it seems to be met with a lot of fear by those who cherish that fantasy of self-sufficiency, including climate denialists, including white supremacists, including anti-vaxxers. There's a wide array of people in that category. Can you please talk to us about how you conceive this interdependency, and if you have found resistance to this idea in a place such as the United States, so deeply rooted in an individualistic tradition?
Yes. Well, the resistance to interdependency is very great, and you are right that it comes from different quarters, from different sources. I think, for instance, we can see in the contemporary debate about masks or the contemporary debate about social gatherings, a number of positions that are both individualist and nationalist. So there's a paradox in this ideology of individualism. Explicitly, the argument goes, I don't like wearing a mask. Nobody can tell me to wear a mask. It doesn't feel good on my face. I can't breathe in my mask. Or a number of people who do not want to be told by the government whether to wear a mask. They should be free to wear what they want on the street. That's a fundamental personal liberty. And at the same time that they are invoking personal liberty and their individual rights, they are saying, I'm an American, I don't need to wear the mask. I'm an American, I can go where I want. I'm an American, I can go to a large football party. I will not be told where to go, how to move, how to live. No government will tell me this. So the paradox is that they want to belong to the category American, or they want to, which is, as you know, a very false way of saying I belong to the United States of America. I mean, we are all American, right? All throughout Las Americas, we are all American. So this particular reduction of America to the United States is already a problem. Okay, so we already have a little nationalism and imperialism in the formulation. So they want to belong to that class, they want to belong to the nation, and they understand it as a right of belonging. So the individual and individualism is a marker of a nationalist ideology. So it actually has a contradiction built into itself, right? Mm-hmm. They belong to the nation, and that supports their individualism. If they don't have their individualism, that's an attack on the nation that they identify with. Now, interestingly, the nation they identify with is not the government. So they have an idea of the nation, which needs to be preserved, which is marked by its individualist ideology, and they need to say no to the government. Now, not all of the government, but just the government that would restrict their, what they call their personal freedom. And those people are very lucky in their own minds because they have a president who runs the government, who also opposes the government, or says he does, and who fights his own government officials and fights his scientific advisors. So, you know, they are dependent on him. He's dependent on their support. They actually belong to a nationalist and fascist political formation. So let's be clear that individualism does not exist outside of this nationalist formation. And in the case of the United States right now, that nationalism is increasingly fascist and white supremacist. So these are large groups of people who believe individualism is the national ideology. But it is also the case that individualism is their way of belonging to the nation. So there is a contradiction at the heart of their ideology. I mean, it's very hard to argue with some people because they, even if they are dependent on each other, and I believe they are, even the white supremacists are dependent on each other. They excite each other, they move each other to action, they arrive as a group. They are dependent on each other, but they have a group identification, if we use that language. But they're still standing in the name of the individual, who is also white and masculine. So if we go back to the idea of the individual, what's the figure or form of the individual? Well, it is white and masculine. So not everybody is an individual. Not all people are individuals according to this individualism.
Yeah.
And they are dependent on each other, on economic infrastructure, on many things, but they disavow that dependency. And that is also part of their misogyny. That is also part of their anti-socialism.
Yeah, no, definitely. And in that in that conception of who is considered and who is not considered an individual, we can immediately talk about feminism, actually, and the reaction of feminism to that ideology, especially in Latin America. In this collection of essays in Sin Miedo, that's translated, it's No Fear Without Fear.
Without fear,
yeah, we can still say that fear plays an important role in many people's lives, and in particular in women's lives, of course. The fear of being abused or killed or raped, the fear of not being heard, the fear of not having a choice, especially now in the US with the current situation with the Supreme Court, that's in risk, and the fear of not getting justice, right? For decades, and this I'll go back to your idea of the tension and paradox between the individual and the collective. For decades, that fear was lived in isolation. Yet feminist movements in Latin America especially have managed to somehow distribute the burden of that fear into a collective. Have the example, well, of Ni Una Menos, of course, that expanded in the whole region, and you work closely with Latin American feminists. And you establish, interestingly, some differences between Ni Una Menos and movements such as Me Too in this book. And I was wondering about those differences you see, and maybe if you can expand on that, and if you trace perhaps more similarities between the strategies used by feminist movements in Latin America and movements such as Black Lives Matter in the US. So if you could talk to us a bit about that, that would be great.
That's a large and wonderful question. Well, first of all, I mean, yes, I live with fear. I think I was awake in the night about the fires, about the fascism, and about COVID, and about the compounded sense of disaster. You know, it would be one thing if we were having to deal with COVID, change our lives in order to not to spread the virus, not to contract the virus. We have developed practices for that, at least some of us have. Some people object to them, but it would be one thing if that's what we were dealing with. But we are also dealing with white supremacists who are now unashamed, who are without shame, and who very loudly support the harassment, discrimination, and violence against people of color, which is a kind of large category here, but it is perhaps in the news mainly African American people or people of African descent, but it is also clearly any number of people from Latin America, and those who are darker are more subject to racism, but not necessarily. And also, let's not forget the assault on the indigenous, which has been going on since the inception of this country. The inception of this country is based on the genocide of native peoples. So this history of violence, which has always been part of American nationalism and American capitalism, U.S. capitalism, and of course in Latin America as well. We know what's happening in the Amazon. We have seen the extraction politics in the Andes. We see that this is coextensive with capitalism and now with neoliberalism, which is, of course, capitalism in a new variant. So this violence is with us, and it's now when we have the Proud Boys, when we have white men on the street harassing Black people or feeling free to kill them or to do violence against them. They do this because they assume that the police will support them, that the police will not intervene, that the police are are for the most part, but not entirely, willing to let that violence happen and not to prosecute those who enact that violence. So the complicity between the white nationalists and the police at this moment is very, very high. And of course, Trump, as he breaks the law in hundreds of ways, stands for law and order, which means that police will have the power to break their own rules, to break the constitutional constraints under which they work. And he is trying very hard to make a kind of solidarity among white supremacists, police, and himself. And if he is not elected, he will call fraud, he will claim fraud, and he will see whether his wretched right-wing solidarity network will show up for him.
Yes.
And my own view is that enough of the army, enough of the police will not have anything to do with this. And even the so-called Proud Boys, the white supremacists on the street, they are very loud, they are very horrible, but they do not have mass following. So the conditions for a fascist takeover are not quite there for him, although he's trying to produce them. That said, different social movements so we are afraid, okay?
Yes.
Con miedo. And yet, we're more afraid when we're home alone reading the newspaper or on screen looking like what's happening, or there are just a few of us in our little shelter. But when we communicate with other groups and we see the kind of mobilization that is happening for Black Lives Matter, for voting rights, just to name two, when we see the social solidarity networks that have emerged to make sure people get medicine, they find ways to go to the hospital, they get medical treatment that they deserve, we start to see that there's a feminist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist movement that, or interlocking set of movements, I would say, not one movement, an interlocking set of movements that are still very strong, most of which supported Bernie Sanders, but some of which are separate from Sanders, right? Whose politics were excellent on healthcare, but certainly excellent on questions of racial justice. But the racial justice movement is bigger than Bernie Sanders, and it is wider and it's more focused. Bernie tended to see capitalism as the real problem, and then there were these other problems that were linked to capital. It's like, yes, we know that beautiful old left framework, but Black Lives Matter is a mass social justice movement, and of course they have a critique of capitalism, but they are not part of somebody else's movement. They're not a secondary oppression, right? And Black Lives Matter has to do with shelter and food and opposing violence and opposing the prison network, the carceral network, which is overwhelmingly filled. It targets Black people and brown people on the street, and it fills its prisons with Black and brown people. So that's a way of taking citizenship rights away from those people, right? It's also a way of taking voting rights away from those people. It takes them out of the public sphere and separates them so they can't be part of a mass movement. So the critique of the prison system has become enormously important for Black Lives Matter. And in this way, it is posing the question, do we turn to the law to save us from the law? Do we turn to the police to save us from the police? Do we turn to the courts and to the prisons to lock away our enemies? Or are the courts and the prisons part of the problem?
And the law.
Yes, yes. So, if you look at Me Too, Me Too is a very important movement, and I support Me Too. It has allowed many women to come forward, to tell their stories, and as more women tell these stories, we see how systemic sexual harassment is to institutions. And when I say systemic, I don't just mean that it happens a lot. It does happen a lot. It's a privilege and power for men and some women to emotionally exploit and sexually harass their students, their workers, their staff, the people who clean their buildings. If they're in power, that means they have the right to do what they want with the bodies of women who are who are uh, who are in positions of less power. It is an assumed privilege, an assumed power. It's part of being an owner. It's part of being in power. It's part of being a man. It's part of being a husband or a father. Right? These are tacit rights that go with these positions. So what Me Too has had to do is to show that this is not your privilege. This is not your power. This is an illegitimate power. It is a privilege that must be destroyed, and to seek to produce another kind of workplace, another kind of family, another kind of public sphere where women are harassed and raped, where this is not your assumed power. Do not assume this as your power, right? The problem is that as long as Me Too remains very individualistic, it's very compelling because an individual story brings to light a power dynamic in a way that a sociological treatise cannot, right? Sociology needs literature. We need stories, we need images, we need ways of speaking about our experience in order to see what is common with others and in order to start to develop an analysis. Now, it's at the level of analysis that I think Me Too is different from Ni Una Menos. And I think it's also at the level of activism, because Me Too tends to go to the law. We have Title IX in our universities or our workplaces. We go, we file complaints, and we ask the law to intervene. We go into these trials or these trial-like structures, and then women are suddenly very constrained by those structures, and they can be made to feel shame again. And very often the results of those kinds of trials are confidential, so it becomes a very individual and very sequestered process. It becomes increasingly private the way it ends. I mean, there are many very famous sexual harassment complaints. We don't know the insides of them. We don't hear the results, or we get some kind of result, but we don't have access. And I think Ni Una Menos, well, first of all, yes, against harassment of all the kinds that Me Too is, against violence against women on the street and in the home, against the economic exploitation of women. That economic dimension I don't believe is with Me Too. And also in favor of assemblies, of new modes of democratic participation and mass mobilization. You know, in the US, when we have the mass mobilization of Me Too, it's like me and me and me and me, and we all stand together as individuals with our stories. And sometimes that's powerful. But where is the feminist movement that mobilizes on the street all of the different issues that women, and I include trans women,
Of course.
and I include trans men, and I include non-gender binary people and travestis, and this coalition is much broader, and I think that it also understands the democratic mobilization of the constituency. The idea of taking over the street, I mean, is beautiful. We have had, of course, that in the U.S. with Take Back the Night, but you know, take back the day too, take back the morning.
Thank you. Yeah, which leads me. You mentioned this in your reply, but which leads me to the relationship between feminism and law, and also between all these social movements and law. We can, I guess, we can see that it's a tense and paradoxical even relationship, right? On the one hand, a radical critique to the patriarchal character of law, but then on the other hand, as you were saying, a demand to be recognized and protected by the law, right? And this tension exists in feminism. And I wanted to ask you about this. Right now in Chile, the law, it's at the very center of a crucial political debate, right? The 2019 social revuelta preceded and also like led by massive feminist demonstrations,
Yes,
led to a referendum that will happen in a few weeks that could mean the end of the constitution imposed during Pinochet's dictatorship. And some feminist movements now push for the writing of a feminist constitution, right? In another turn of that tense relationship to law. You were talking, and this is something that's fascinating as well, about the critique of the prison, right? But this also lives together with some feminists asking, or that have become quite punitive in the way they approach the law. So I was wondering, as a feminist intellectual and as an activist as well, what's your relationship? How do you believe law can still play such an important role in social change, or do you approach the law with more distrust, with a bit more skepticism?
Look, I think in the US we have, and you have this in Chile as well. In the US, we have a tradition of radical lawyering. So radical lawyering, these are practices of using the law to produce greater freedoms, using the law to produce greater justice. So the civil rights movement had its lawyers, but it had its mass mobilization. Mm-hmm. The feminist movement had its lawyers, even trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment. That was an effort to make a feminist change at the level of the Constitution. We have radical lawyers, which includes people from all colors and genders who fought against stop and frisk in New York, where police were just stopping random black men and throwing them against the wall and violating their liberties as individuals to walk on the street without harassment. So we can use radical lawyering to oppose police violence. But of course, the law always has two sides. There's civil rights law, which I think is extremely important. There's equality law, expanding our ideas of what equal treatment mean. Gay, lesbian, trans people have benefited from radical queer lawyering that gave them rights to get married and gave them rights to not be fired from their job on the basis of their gender or their sexual orientation. And these kinds of legal accomplishments are, in my mind, very important. When we fight abuse in prison, when we fight violence in prison, we need lawyers. When we try to stop the practice of solitary confinement and the death penalty in the US, we need lawyers. And these are radical lawyers, and they are doing good work. So I'm not against the law. What I think people are much more worried about is the punitive dimension of the law, the prison system, the police understood as the long arm of the law. That's a kind of American expression, I think. Yeah. They not only apply the law, they cite the law, but they also make the law on the spot. Like, well, I'm a policeman, I'll say what the law is. So policing and punishment are now being radically rethought, right? So defund the police, the dismantlement or abolition of the prison system, those movements are also trying to understand, well, how could some of those functions be provided through other ways so that we are not in the business of destroying basic rights of citizenship or authorizing modes of violence, systemic violence, that disproportionately injure and subjugate people of color. So I think both of those things can happen at the same time. So, the law is, for me, not one thing. It works in different directions. I support radical lawyering. I need the radical lawyers. I mean, I adopted my son. I couldn't have done that without a lovely radical lawyer, in a queer law firm who didn't charge me very much. So, my ability to move in the world, or even to become, non-binary, which I am now legally, that was not possible years ago. And I am able to have a legal status that means something to me, and that allows me to negotiate the social world in a more powerful way, so that people don't assume I'm a she, or depending on how I'm dressed, or a he. It's like, don't assume that about me. Ask me, just ask me. Anti-rape law, fabulous feminist lawyer. So I think we have to be careful on this topic. I understand the racial violence done by the carceral system, and that we must oppose. There's no question.
Thank you. Yes, no, it's such right now in my country, it's such a big debate on the Constitution in particular, that the question of the role of the law has been very present in current debates. Yes.
Well, but I think that this rewriting of the Constitution, there are many questions about it. Like, who is doing the rewriting? Who's participating in the rewriting? Whose interests does it serve? Is there language there that can be used even if those who draft it do not intend for that use, right? So let's say a radical feminist use, it becomes possible through that Constitution. But constitutions are made and unmade, but they have to be made in such a way that they reflect the democracy that they are also supposed to protect. And in Chile, I think we have seen for too long that it's the state interests and the economic interests that all too often get supported at the expense of working people, of women, and of the indigenous.
Yes, for way too long. You were talking about violence in the U.S. and how all these violence are kind of overlap. We're living in a time of where disaster is present in different levels, and violence is present in different ways. Your book reflects on what you call courageous discourse, and the challenge of imagining non-violent ways to resist. You call it an active non-violence to oppose something like more or passive. In October, and I'm again referring to this, in 2019, millions of people took the streets in Chile in this great collective manifestation of discontent.
Yes.
Dignidad was the key word of that new political imagination. These protests were very violently repressed by that arm of the law, as you very well call it.
Yes.
More than 400 people suffered eye mutilation as a result of direct action of the police. More than 3,000 people, including children, are still imprisoned under repressive laws. And I have two questions that also relate to Latin America more generally, and also actually to the US and the current state. You were mentioning this Proud Boys and all these fascist groups that are present there. And I'm wondering, how do legitimate rage, and non-violence coexist in the face of injustice and systemic violence? And also, if you could please tell us a bit more about how you imagine non-violent resistance in a region, and I'm talking now about all the Americas now, where state violence is taking new forms, often less clear and less explicit, right, than the violence of our dictatorial past.
Yes. Well, perhaps the problem is that some of the very techniques of the dictatorial past resurfaced in the treatment of protesters in 2019, at the same time that new forms of violence were brought to bear on the situation. I mean, I'm not the person to comment so much on Chilean politics, although I do follow, but it seems to me that un violador en tu camino, see,
Tesis, yes.
The Chilean chant, which is very, very powerful, that is an example of aggressive nonviolence, right? It's not pacifist in the sense of pacifico, right? It's not quiet. It may be meditative, but it's also fierce. It's not the withdrawal from the world. It is anger, it is rage, it is also the collective claim put in song, in bodily movement, and in the public sphere, re-functioning the public sphere as a space of protest and inhabitation, right? People living on the street, people claiming the street, or El Camino, which is precisely the place where too many women are harassed or assaulted, right? So you take that place and you change it into the place where women feel most safe because they are together and they own it. They own it. They have taken ownership over the street. Now that is radical. It's strong. It's angry. It's raging, but it's not violent. It exposes violence with rage, but it is not itself violent. Now, a policeman might say, oh, this is a violent mob. Now, and we get that here too, like peaceful protest, Black Lives Matter, people mourning the loss of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, mourning the loss in public, angry about the loss in public, and suddenly that's called an angry mob doing violence. Or the few people on the sidelines who take advantage of the situation to do violence are understood to be exemplary of the movement. That's the movement. They're violent. At which point the police crackdown becomes a reasonable alternative. So I do think there can be raging nonviolence. And I think we need to get rid of the idea that nonviolence involves suppressing our aggression and our anger and our rage. It's about cultivating it collectively. It's a collective form. It takes a kind of crafting, as you would craft a mobile work of art. Right? It's a cultivation of rage and a collaborative cultivation of rage.
Yeah, fantastic. It's interestingly you were saying how the government, in this case, because it happened in Chile as well, calls a certain demonstration violent, right? And in your book and in general, in your work, there's always a great concern with language and how that creates sort of a reality or has a normative power. You conceive of violence, for example, not only in terms of a strike, a golpe, but also violence in the structural conditions that make that strike possible, and as you were saying, the justifications that arise after that strike, right? In Latin America, and we see this in the US too, but also in Chile and in Brazil, you've lived that personally. We have witnessed the re-emergence of neo-fascist groups. We heard the President of the United States basically calling them in the latest debate into action. We have seen attacks on LGBT people, more attacks than before here in Chile. We have seen human rights memorials being destroyed, painted over.
Yes.
And we've seen mostly like also a very violent resurgence of denialist speech, right?
Yes.
And I'm wondering, it's something you talk about very beautifully in Sin Miedo, about the role you think memory plays in imagining the future.
Well, you know, one thing that has become clear to me in traveling to Argentina and Chile, and Brazil to a certain degree as well, that the history of the disappeared is one that many people who advance neoliberal government, who are very market driven, they actually want to, or who identify with the army, or who are themselves fascists. They want to erase the history, but erasing the trace of that history is itself a kind of violence, I would say, because what it does, it says effectively that was not an attack on the population, that was a civil war, or that was civil strife, or that was two parts of the population in a fight with each other, which of course is not quite right, since there was a government power that systematically detained, tortured, and disappeared, killed thousands and thousands of people. And the documentation has been very full and very impressive, both by arts centers and public memorials and museums. And of course, if that history gets told, then there are people who remain accountable. And if that history gets told, then police powers will be restricted. And of course, police powers, brutal police powers, go along with neoliberalism. You know, it's free market, it's freedom of the individual, and yet this freedom has to be protected by a militarized police. And I think we've not yet thought well enough, or at least I haven't, about what is the link between police violence and the forms of market liberty and personal liberty that go with neoliberal advancement and keeping those markets open. So, so I suppose I think we need to understand what you call denialism or negationism as a tactic to that helps governments to amass and keep police powers that do understand themselves as having the prerogative to disperse the left, to contain the left, to imprison the left, to attack the left, and even in forms of disappearance, which we know certainly we can document. I mean, the U.S. is now actively involved in practices of disappearance. The ICE comes to people's homes and takes them out. You know, I don't know if we taught that to you through the Panama School, or you taught that to us, or this is a kind of technique that keeps circling around the Americas. We take them away. They have no contact. Nobody knows where they are. Nobody knows if they have health care. Nobody knows if they have access to legal services. They are taken, they are dumped, they're maybe taken to Mexico and dumped. Dumped where? In places that are very dangerous to them, where they have no resources, or kept in detention camps, the full number of which we do not know. Right, so we are starting to resemble the very countries we trained. We trained you how to detain and torture and disappear. And now we are practicing those very lessons. It used to be we could say, oh, they do that in the South, but we don't do that. It's like, no, no, no. We were always involved in those practices, and now we are explicitly.
Yes, a strange, rather terrible turn of events, really. I have a bit more time, so I'll ask you two more questions. Going back to the concept of interdependency and the opposite, the self-standing individual, I was wondering if we can trace a political parallel. And interestingly, you're talking about who taught who, right? So with another concept, which is state sovereignty, right? Yes. So sovereignty seems to be, or supposedly is an absolute limit of all political debates nowadays. We see it here in Chile. Human rights and humanitarian law tried to establish limits, right, after the Second World War to the sovereignty of the states. However, that's being questioned, and states are going and started to get out of human rights treaties, for example. And interestingly, we don't seem to be doing the same with the destruction of the environment, right? Chile now refused to sign the Acuerdo de Escazú that would actually establish some limitations to sovereignty. Half of Argentina, half of Brazil are burning. You're talking to be now with smoke in your house coming from also like a very large, out of control fire. Some Chilean territories are called zonas de sacrificio, so areas of sacrifice. So how do you think, how would sovereignty change under a normative ideal of mutual interdependency?
Well, you know, it's very complex, the history of sovereignty. For instance, in Hawaii, there is a sovereignty movement because they have been colonized for so long as a state. I mean, they are a state, but they understand themselves as living under, many do, living under a situation of settler colonialism. And for them, sovereignty would be about reclaiming the land and the government and the environment and breaking free of US federal regulations, which have allowed massive tourism to destroy the biodiversity of the islands, not fully destroyed, but really threatening it. So sovereignty for colonized people is different, right? The claim to sovereignty is a claim to political
self-determination, perhaps.
Political self-determination, exactly. Yeah. So to some degree, sovereignty has that. State sovereignty is different than popular sovereignty. Now, whether the Hawaiian sovereignty movement wants a state is a good question. And similarly in Palestine, there is a struggle for political self-determination on the part of the Palestinian people, but they are also arguing, like, do we want a state? What form would it take? Now, it may be that the Palestinian people, if really allowed to choose to vote to determine what political form they live in, they may choose the two-state solution. They may choose a one-state solution that involves no discrimination against Palestinians and does not give Jewish Israelis special privileges. They might try to institute equality that way, or they might say, no, we need autonomous state functions that are linked through a federal model, right? Somewhat like the European Union or other areas like Canada, which has its cantons. So sovereignty can take different forms. And of course, in the history of political thought, sovereign power is the final and ultimate power, right? There's all kinds of things you can do, but there's a state, there's a court that tells you in the end what can and cannot happen. Well, what if sovereignty is distributed? What if there's no one court and one state officer or office that embodies sovereign power? What if sovereign power is popular and it is distributed so that there's always a negotiation, there's always a cohabitation and a commitment to interdependency that that supports that model. I think sovereignty is something we need to, we can't just oppose it because we oppose one of its forms or even its dominant form. We need to experiment with what distributed sovereignty might be. Are there forms of distributed sovereignty that actually acknowledge interdependency, specific kinds of cultural differences, and also equality? I mean, that would be the question. And those sorts of collaborative models, I believe, are much more important than forms of national sovereignty, which are nationalist, which are based on borders. What would borders look like under a more distributed model of sovereignty? Borders would be sites of passage and also sites of distinction, but they would not be sites of police violence. So, you know, I think we need to experiment. We need some radical imaginative experimentation with the idea of popular sovereignty and what forms of governance, may or may not be a state, what forms of governance could that give rise to?
Which leads me very nicely to my very last question before Aldo interrupts, which which has to do with the fact that we are really just a few weeks away from the US election, a few weeks away from the Chilean referendum. And I was wondering, you're talking about popular sovereignty, is a very interesting concept. And we often hear how elections tend to be seen as like the culmination of democracy, but you talk about a radical imagination, and you talk also about a radical democracy. So I'm wondering about what your vision of that radical democracy is in face of what you're currently living in the US. So that's my last question for you.
Well, maybe I could put it to you this way. I would say that most everybody on the left is going to vote against Trump in order to stop his fascism. It doesn't mean that we love Biden or Kamala Harris. I mean, they're both very, they both have many political liabilities, problems. We don't identify with them. But we will seek to elect them so that we can fight them, because we would rather fight them. So we elect them and we fight them, like almost at the exact same moment, because electoral politics is important. There's no question in my mind. I would not say, oh, electoral politics is fake, it's all bad, it's all the same. I think that's a dangerous view, and it's simply not true. I think Biden is a centrist conservative, but he's not a fascist. Kamala Harris is she's a carceral feminist, but she is not a fascist. And she also has a very strong commitment to civil rights in some domains. She's not consistent. So it's the social movements where popular democracy really lives. So there's electoral democracy, and then there's popular democracy. Social movements are crucial, in part because they can affect elections, but affecting elections is not the end. It's the radical transformation of economics and society, of the household, of the workplace. And these happen throughout civil society. They happen in public and private spheres. They break down the rigidity of the distinction between the public and the private. And that kind of radical reconfiguration of life and of society has more power to express a radical democratic set of aims. And by radical democratic, I really mean a democracy that is not just more inclusive, although it must be, but that animates more of the population to try to establish the conditions of their lives. And that takes forms of solidarity that are not the same as party affiliations. And solidarity is not easy to make, especially across class and across educational differences, across race. There's lots of suspicion that has to be overcome, but it's by working together, I think, that we do establish these networks of solidarity. So the mutual aid societies, the solidarity networks that we see, the networks of care that we see, allow us to start to rethink healthcare, allow us to rethink who in the family is doing the domestic work, and how can that be reconfigured. Rethink the workplace and the entitlements and the safety issues that pertain there. So there always has to be a radical democracy outside of the electoral system to affect that system, but not to be swallowed by it, if you see what I mean.
Yes, fantastic. Well, I could keep on going for another hour, but I will stop now. I would really like to thank you, Judith, for this opportunity. It's been fantastic. And I would like to invite everyone who's listening and seeing today to read Judith Butler's work. I think it's crucial for understanding the present, and it's also crucial to reimagine the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Estoy muy de acuerdo contigo, Alia. Podríamos haber estado hablando 3 horas por lo menos. Espero que esta instancia se vuelva a repetir. Les damos entonces las gracias a ti, Judith, a ti, Alia, por tan generosa participación en la presentación de este libro, en el marco de este festival. Agradecemos nuevamente a la Corporación del Libro y a Sura, y los invitamos entonces a leer Sin Miedo, su más reciente libro, pero también todos sus otros libros que están disponibles. Los invitamos a leer la obra completa de Judith Butler, que es de una actualidad innegable. Muchísimas gracias. Nos estamos viendo. Hasta luego.
Gracias.